My parents chose to go on vacation with my brother instead of attending my wedding, even after I told them 6 months in advance. Now they're crying because I didn't wait for them. 5 days ago, I married my girlfriend of 6 years in a small, intimate ceremony. Initially, it was just supposed to be a gathering of our families and a few close friends. Unfortunately, or maybe it's better to say fortunately, my family didn't show up. To be more specific, they could have come, but they decided that going on a family trip to Australia with my brother and his family was more important. My wife and I had been together for 6 years, and we got engaged about 10 months ago. Although we didn't send out official invitations until about 4 weeks before the big day, we knew the date we wanted. In fact, we told our families a full 8 months in advance so they'd have plenty of time to clear their schedules. My parents even assured me they'd keep it in mind, so I really didn't expect them to pull what they did. Looking back, though, maybe I should have seen it coming. My relationship with my parents has always been strained. Growing up, my brother was the gifted one, while I got labeled as the troublemaker. He's 8 years older than me, and it always felt like he was better at everything: grades, sports, you name it. As a kid, I hoped that sense of being overshadowed would fade with time, but it never really did. It might have been different if my brother hadn't been so arrogant, but he had a knack for getting under my skin. He'd mock me, bully me, and rope his friends into it, too. I was a pretty scrawny kid back then, so he had no trouble making me feel small. I'd complain to my parents, but they'd never believe me. To them, my brother was practically perfect and couldn't possibly do anything wrong. This went on for years, and by the time I hit high school, I was so full of resentment that I started acting out on purpose. If I couldn't measure up to my brother's achievements, at least I could be memorable in other ways. That rebellious streak stuck with me as I grew up. Meanwhile, my brother, who already had a job by then, just couldn't resist showing off every chance he got. One day, not long after I graduated high school, he made some snide comment about me being a disappointment, and I snapped. Years of pent-up frustration boiled over, and we finally came to blows. It wasn't pretty. I got a few hits in, and he definitely walked away with a black eye, but I didn't come out unscathed either. That fight happened almost 10 years ago, and we haven't spoken since. Honestly, I'm better off for it. I think that fight let me vent a lot of anger I'd been carrying, and cutting him out of my life has been one of the best decisions I've ever made. Of course, my parents didn't see it that way. They were furious with me and convinced I'd started the fight on purpose. They never believed that my brother had been provoking me for years, and they didn't change their minds after that day either. Things were pretty icy between us for weeks, and it wasn't until I left for college that things started to improve, probably because they realized they'd soon be empty nesters and wanted to patch things up before I moved out. Still, I couldn't forget the way they treated me compared to my brother. Even though I kept in touch with them over the years, that resentment never fully went away. The only reason I invited them to my wedding at all was because, well, they're my only immediate family. I'm not close to any of my other relatives, and my grandparents passed away years ago. Despite our rocky relationship, we've made an effort to stay in contact over the past decade. My parents tried several times to convince me to reconcile with my brother, but neither of us was interested. He got married about 6 years ago and has 2 kids now. I wasn't invited to his wedding, and honestly, I didn't care. This time around, my parents pushed me to invite him to my wedding, but there was no chance of that happening. He's still the same arrogant jerk he's always been. We see each other at family gatherings during the holidays, and while we don't acknowledge each other anymore, his behavior hasn't changed one bit. I know my parents have always had a soft spot for him, more than they ever did for me. But even so, I didn't expect them to choose a vacation with him over attending my wedding. Deep down, I can't help but think he orchestrated this just to rub salt in the wound. He knew they'd pick him over me, it's what they've always done. And if his goal was to make me feel awful, well, mission accomplished. Just a couple of weeks ago, after we sent out the formal invitations, my parents came by to tell me they probably wouldn't make it. Apparently, 3 days earlier, my brother invited them to join him and his family on an all-expenses-paid trip to Australia. It was a perk from his job, something to do with impressing a big client, and the timing couldn't be changed. My parents actually suggested I postpone the wedding to accommodate them since it was just friends and family anyway, and the venue belonged to one of my wife's relatives. Of course, my parents thought it was perfectly reasonable to expect me to postpone my wedding instead of them skipping their vacation. They went on and on about how excited they were to spend time with their grandkids and how they hoped I'd understand. I wanted to argue so badly, but instead, I just smiled and said, "Okay, I'll wait." They were so oblivious they didn't even realize I wasn't serious. They took my answer at face value, seemed satisfied, and left. Later, I talked it over with my wife, and she was just as shocked as I was. We both knew my brother had always been their priority, but for them to be this blatant about pushing me aside felt like a slap in the face. There was no way we were going to postpone our wedding. We decided to go through with it, whether they were there or not. So, 5 days ago, we got married as planned. That evening, we posted some pictures online, and it wasn't long before my parents saw them. They were stunned because, in their minds, I had promised to wait. They started calling and texting me right away, but I ignored every single message. It was my wedding day, and I wasn't about to let them ruin it. The next morning, I finally looked at the texts they'd sent. Just as I'd expected, they were full of disappointment and accusations about how I'd betrayed them. I figured it was time to clear the air, so I gave them a call to hash things out. They picked up almost immediately, and the yelling started right away. They told me how humiliated they were and how everyone in the family was shocked to see pictures of my wedding without them there. Apparently, since I'm not particularly close to my extended family and keep to myself a lot, nobody really expected an invite to my wedding. But they all assumed my parents would be there. When they weren't, it caused quite a stir, and now my parents had to deal with a flood of awkward questions. Typical. They cared more about what everyone else thought than about how their actions had made me feel. I didn't hold back. I told them I had no intention of waiting for them to return from their vacation, no matter what I'd said. I only told them I'd wait because I knew arguing was pointless. There was no way they were going to skip a free vacation with my brother and his family, even if it meant missing my wedding. And frankly, I didn't have the energy to fight them on it. I told them I had every right to go through with my wedding and didn't owe them an explanation. Then I brought up everything, how they'd always treated me unfairly, never believed me about my brother, and couldn't see him for the arrogant jerk he was. I even pointed out how obvious it was that my brother had timed the vacation on purpose, knowing full well they'd pick him over me. This whole thing was a power move for him, and he'd won. They had proved, once and for all, that he mattered more to them than I ever did. I told them I was done being cast aside and that they no longer had any right to question my choices. I was ready to hang up when they dropped a bombshell. According to them, my brother had no idea I was getting married. They claimed they hadn't even told him about the wedding, and since I hadn't invited the rest of the family, no one else knew either. They insisted that if I'd been upfront with them and said I wasn't willing to wait, they would have skipped the vacation to be there for me. But instead, they accused me of playing mind games and acting like a victim in a situation I'd supposedly created myself. That threw me off. I hadn't expected them to shift the blame onto me so boldly. So, I stayed on the line and let them explain. They told me they hadn't mentioned my wedding to my brother because they didn't think it was relevant, and when he invited them on the trip, it wasn't out of spite, he genuinely didn't know. They said they only chose to go on the vacation because they felt it might be their last chance for a trip like this, given how busy my brother's been since starting his business. So, instead of outright declining my brother's invitation, my parents said they decided to talk to me first. They wanted to see if I'd be okay with postponing my wedding by a couple of weeks. They claimed that if I'd told them no, and been upfront about it, they would have canceled the vacation and been there for the wedding. They also brought up the past, admitting that maybe they were partly at fault for never believing me about my brother's behavior. But then they turned it back on me, saying I hadn't helped my case because, growing up, I'd always been a troublemaker, seeking attention in extreme ways and creating unnecessary drama. So, in their eyes, it wasn't entirely their fault for siding with my brother when I accused him of being awful to me. Hearing them say that made me pause for a moment. Maybe they had a point. I wasn't ready to admit it to myself then, though, so I accused them of bluffing. I told them there was no way my brother didn't know I was getting married, and even if he didn't, they wouldn't have told me otherwise after I'd accused him of orchestrating this whole situation. I said that if they truly cared about being at my wedding, they wouldn't have even asked me to postpone it, they would have just shown up, no questions asked. I accused them of making excuses to cover up their mistakes and gaslighting me into thinking this was all my fault. I was expecting them to fight back, but instead, they sighed and told me I hadn't changed. In their eyes, I was still the same troublemaker I'd been growing up, always seeking attention in the worst ways. Then, they hung up. I could tell my mom had been crying. She must have been deeply hurt by seeing my wedding photos online while she was on vacation. But honestly, I was just as hurt. I didn't even try to see things from their perspective for the first couple of days. Now, though, I can't stop replaying the conversation in my head. The more I think about it, the less sure I feel about whether I was completely in the right. At first, I was convinced I hadn't done anything wrong. But now? I don't know. There's no way to prove if my brother knew about my wedding or not. Maybe my gut feeling is right, and he planned the timing of the vacation deliberately. It's just too coincidental. But I have no actual evidence, just suspicion. And if I'm wrong, then yeah, I guess I did mess up. Still, I can't shake the belief that if my parents truly cared about being there for me, they wouldn't have even considered going on vacation. They wouldn't have asked me to postpone the wedding at all. On the flip side, if I'd been honest with them when they first brought it up, maybe things would have turned out differently. I just don't know anymore. One thing I do know is that my parents were right about something. I didn't make it easy for them to take my side when I was younger. I was a troublemaker, a total brat, to be honest. My brother, meanwhile, always played the role of the golden child. He worked hard, excelled at everything, and presented himself as the perfect kid, even though I knew how cruel he could be behind closed doors. I can't take away his achievements, though. He did his best, and maybe if I'd channeled my energy into being more like him, things could have been different. Maybe my parents would have found it easier to see my side of things. Now, I'm left wondering if I owe my parents an apology. I've spent my entire life believing they favored my brother unfairly. But maybe it wasn't all bias. Maybe I played a part in making things harder for myself. And even now, I don't know if my brother knew about my wedding. I'm stuck in this limbo, second-guessing everything. A week after the wedding, my parents came back from their vacation. They didn't even go home first, they came straight to my house from the airport, luggage and all. My wife and I have talked through the situation countless times, and I've gone over what happened with friends. Opinions are split, some think I was justified, others believe the drama could have been avoided. But honestly, at this point, the damage is done. Whatever needed to break has already broken, and I don't think my parents or I will ever fully move on from this. I had pretty much given up on reconciling with my parents. Honestly, I didn't even want to try. It felt pointless. They had spent my entire life favoring my brother, and even during our last phone call, they didn't deny it. They admitted it but turned around and tried to put some of the blame on me. I had come to terms with the fact that we saw things differently, maybe both sides were right, or maybe we were all wrong, but at this point, it didn't matter. Nothing could undo what had already happened. That was how I planned to move forward, but apparently, my parents had other ideas. When they showed up at my door, still dragging their luggage, I was confused. At first, I thought they'd come to stay with me, and that idea scared me a little. But they quickly clarified that they'd come straight from the airport. I invited them in, but they didn't waste any time on small talk. Right away, they told me it was obvious from my behavior that we needed to have a serious conversation if we wanted to keep this family intact. I was caught off guard because I had no intention of having that conversation. I already knew how it would go, just more talking in circles without ever getting anywhere. So I told them I needed time and space to sort out my feelings. But they pushed back, saying they'd made the effort to come straight to me after their vacation because I was important to them. They insisted I needed to treat them with the same importance and talk about things now. That hit a nerve. I was already upset about everything that had gone down with my family, so their insistence felt like yet another example of them disregarding my feelings. My anger boiled over, and I snapped. I told them just because they were ready to talk didn't mean I had to be. If they truly wanted to make things right, they should have respected my need for space instead of trying to force the conversation on their terms. I told them they needed to understand that I wasn't some puppet they could control. That set off a shouting match. They were just as upset as I was, and neither side was willing to back down. Finally, my wife stepped in and asked them to leave, saying nothing productive was going to come out of a conversation like this. Before they left, my mom, who's always been the more emotional one, said something that stuck with me. Through tears, she admitted that maybe she and my dad had failed as parents because no one would treat their parents like this unless something had gone wrong along the way. But then she said that I, too, had failed as their son at times, and they'd always forgiven me and tried to make things work. She said if they were important to me, I'd try to do the same instead of constantly painting myself as the perfect victim while making them the villains. I wanted to respond, but seeing her so emotional stopped me. I couldn't bring myself to say anything. After they left, my wife calmed me down because I was still fuming. Since then, we've been trying to figure out how to handle this mess. Honestly, I'm at my wit's end. I don't want to paint my parents as villains, but I also don't feel like I'm the bad guy here. Part of me wants to blame my brother for all of this, but the truth is, I still don't know if he had anything to do with it. Even if he did, it was ultimately my parents' decision to skip my wedding for a vacation with him. It feels like I'm back to square one, unsure of what to do or how to move forward. Update 2. Before I dive into this, let me address something. A lot of people have suggested I just cut my parents off, but it's not that simple. If it were, I wouldn't even be here talking about this. Families are complicated. It's not like my parents have always been terrible to me, there were good times, too. This situation is just messy. I'm not perfect, and neither are they. Right now, my only options are to let things get so bad that cutting them off becomes unavoidable or to try and work things out. I'm leaning toward the second option because, honestly, I want to approach this like a sane person. The last time I saw my parents was 3 days ago, and that didn't end well. Afterward, I decided to go back to my original plan, keep things low-key and maintain some distance. My wife agreed because we didn't have any better ideas. Then, last night, my parents texted me. They apologized for how they'd behaved during our last meeting. They admitted they shouldn't have pushed me or yelled at me and that they should have respected my need for space. They said they were sorry for everything that had happened but still wanted to make things work. They asked if I'd be willing to meet them for dinner this weekend. Now, my wife and I are discussing whether or not to go. We both know it's going to be awkward, there's no way to avoid talking about everything that's happened over the past few weeks. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Despite everything, it seemed like my parents were genuinely trying to make amends. I didn't want to completely sever ties with them, so I decided to give them the chance they were asking for. Maybe by talking things out, we could salvage what was left of our relationship. It was clear that years of misunderstandings and miscommunication had built up, and while I wasn't sure what to expect, I knew I didn't want to lose them. So, my wife and I agreed to meet them this weekend. We were nervous, but we tried to stay optimistic. I was hoping for clarity, some kind of resolution, something to finally make sense of this mess. Update 3. I wish I could say it went well, but honestly, it was a disaster. When my wife and I arrived at my parents' house, I was blindsided. My brother and his family were there. My parents know I don't get along with him, and yet they thought it was a good idea to set up a surprise confrontation. It felt manipulative and cruel, regardless of whatever their intentions might have been. I wasn't the only one caught off guard, my brother looked just as surprised to see me. Clearly, our parents had lied to both of us. When I confronted them, they insisted this was their way of addressing the root of the family's problems. They claimed the tension between me and my brother was at the heart of everything, with me believing they favored him and him holding a grudge against me for a fight that happened over a decade ago. Their idea? Force us to talk it out over dinner. I told them flat out that I wasn't here for that. I came to talk to them, not my brother. For once, he agreed, and we both decided to leave. That's when my mom, predictably, started crying. She said she couldn't believe her sons were letting pride and ego outweigh the value of family. I was about to argue, but before I could, my brother, clearly fed up, stepped in. He told my mom that if she wanted to talk about family values, she should look in the mirror. She was the one who had agreed to go on vacation with his family, even though she knew I was getting married at the same time. And then, out of nowhere, my brother admitted something I wasn't expecting. He said he had known about my wedding when he planned the vacation. But, according to him, it wasn't done to ruin anything for me. He explained that he was about to start a major project, and it was his last chance to take a break before being swamped with work. He claimed it had nothing to do with me or my wedding, but he also pointed out that our parents had a choice and they chose to go on that trip. Now, instead of owning up to it, they were trying to make it seem like the two of us were the problem. Hearing him say that was like the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. I realized there was no path forward with my parents. They had chosen sides back then, and now they were lying about it, trying to gaslight me into thinking I was the one in the wrong. I couldn't take it anymore. I told them I was done, walked out, and went home. Later that night, I blocked them on everything. For the first time in years, I feel like I have some clarity. My wife and I are focusing on each other now. We've decided to move up our honeymoon. We had originally planned to wait a couple of months, but after all this, I need to get away. At the end of the day, I've realized I'm better off without them. It hurts, but at least now, I can finally start moving forward without all the baggage.